Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to be concluding our three-part series on getting strength and hypertrophy gains in the deltoid muscle by looking specifically at the posterior deltoid. If you want more information on the anatomy of the deltoid as a whole, go back and watch part 1 of the series where we talk about that at the start of the video. At this point, I'll assume we're all on the same page with understanding the anatomy of the deltoid muscle, specifically of the posterior deltoid. Let's get into how you get strength and hypertrophy gains. What exercises do you use, and what are some tips on executing those correctly? Back in part 1 of the series, when we talked about the anatomy, I mentioned that the actions of the posterior deltoid include external rotation, but it's going to do so more when the arm is in an elevated position like that. It's also going to be shoulder extension and then shoulder horizontal abduction. It turns out that you're going to get the best bang for your buck if you target the posterior deltoid using that horizontal abduction type of motion. But when we perform this horizontal abduction motion against resistance, there's one big problem. Assuming we neglect the SC and the AC joints, right? There are two major joints that are contributing to that overall movement. From the front side, as you see me here, you can easily see the glenohumeral joint movement. That's the horizontal abduction over which the posterior deltoid certainly has control. But from the back side, which you really can't see from this angle, the scapulothoracic joint, or the scapula. The scapula is moving into retraction as we do this movement. And if you're not careful, you might actually minimize the percent contribution of the posterior deltoid, and the middle traps and the rhomboids, which perform scapular retraction, can take over the movement. So whenever you're doing these exercises we're about to talk about, there's two ways that you can minimize the contribution of the retractors of the scapula, okay? One way, which you can see right here, is you just lower the weight and perform higher repetitions. When you are lifting a lot of weight, the body has this nasty habit of pulling on whatever it has to accomplish the movement, okay? If you're doing a deadlift and you have really weak glutes, you can still lift some decent amount of weights, but it's going to contribute heavily from the hamstrings, okay? The body's going to pull on whatever it has. So if you're using a lot of weight, your body's going to have no choice but to start recruiting a lot of the scapular retractors. Now, you can't avoid those completely, but if you lower the weight significantly and then just perform higher repetitions when you do this movement, you can get a much better mind-muscle connection with the posterior deltoid and increase its percent contribution to the movement, okay? The other thing that you can do is you can allow the scapula to protract, especially when the arm's coming across the body. Allow the scapula to protract and try to keep it as protracted as possible when you're doing the movement, and that also can minimize the activity of the retractors, okay? Keep it protracted. We'll talk more about that when we look at the specific exercises, which we're about to do right now. Let's actually start with exercise number 1, which is a cable rear delt fly. Now, you can see right here that I'm performing this bilaterally first. We'll see unilateral in just a minute. When you're performing bilateral rear delt flies with a cable machine, as you allow the arms to come and cross in front of you, you are allowing the scapulas to protract. As you allow the scapulas to protract, that's actually putting a pretty good stretch on the posterior deltoid. And if your aim is hypertrophy, as we talked about in other videos, that stretch becomes super important, okay? Then, when you bring the arms back down or across into horizontal abduction, there's two things you want to focus on. One, you're not bringing these at 90 degrees, okay? It turns out that the posterior deltoid is going to be recruited best when you aim a little bit below 90 degrees. So 60 degrees is a good proxy. So instead of here, as you come across, bring the arms down a little bit more like this, okay? That's about 60 degrees on each side. Somewhere in the 60 to 70 degree range works for most people, okay? The other thing is, when you're bringing the arms across, don't squeeze the shoulder blades together, because if you do that, now you're getting a lot more retractors contributing. Imagine, I heard this once in a different video, if you imagine that you are in one of those pools full of money, like there's a bunch of cash everywhere in the pool, and you're just in the middle of the pool, and you get a chance to do a breaststroke, and every dollar bill that you touch, you get to keep. You want to have your arms as protracted as possible, because if you're in here, you don't get as much money. If you're out here, you get a lot more. So that's a good cue when you're doing these types of exercises, is as the scapulars are protracted here, try to keep them protracted as you bring the arms down. And if you do that, assuming that you've got a low enough weight to where the retractors don't take over, you're going to maximize the activity of the posterior deltoid there, okay? Imagine doing a breaststroke when you're swimming, okay? Every bit of that money you touch, you get to keep, okay? That's a really good cue on these bilateral rear delt flies, okay? And then we switch over to the unilateral version of this, where we get an utterly massive stretch on the posterior deltoid as it comes across the body. Now, as it comes across the body, you don't want your entire body to turn, particularly at the hips and the lumbar spine. So you want to keep the core pretty stable there. But as you bring the arm across, you can allow the T-spine to rotate and that scapula to protract a lot. The more that scapula protracts across the body, the more stretch that posterior deltoid is going to get. And then as you come back across, keep that scapula protracted. And in general, you're not going all the way out here. When you're emphasizing this stretched position unilaterally, you might go just a little past midline and then come back. The emphasis here is on the stretched position, not going all the way into the shortened position, okay? Really, by emphasizing this stretch half of the range of motion, that also minimizes the degree of scapular retractors that are taking over the movement. So you maximize the percent contribution of posterior deltoid, okay? If I was going more from a hypertrophy standpoint, I would probably want to do the unilateral version of this. If I wanted to just get some really good strength gains out of the rear delts, I would be more tempted to do the bilateral version. But don't kid yourself, the bilateral version can still be good for hypertrophy. So now we're going to move on to exercise number 2, and it's still a rear delt fly, but instead of doing it on the cable machine, I'm going to be doing it, as you can see right here, on the pec deck machine. Now, this movement is executed pretty much the same way as we saw on the cables, so for that reason I'm not going to show the bilateral version, but I am showing the unilateral version, and again, this is excellent for hypertrophy. Some people may actually get better gains in hypertrophy on this version because it's a more stable exercise. Okay, first of all, you're sitting. Second of all, with one hand I can hold onto the machine, and then with the other hand it moves on a fixed track, so I can execute the movement that way. Because it moves on a fixed track, though, you have to be careful, first of all, where you grip it and the exact seat height. Because if you're not careful, you may be pulling straight across with that shoulder at 90 degrees of abduction. And what do we know about that? That's not ideal for recruiting the posterior deltoid. I want it more at that 60 degree, maybe 60, 70 degrees of abduction, right? So what I need to do is I need to grip it in a way and adjust the seat height in such a manner that when I pull across, I'm going more into that 60 to 70 degree angle, not up here. And for every person, that setup is going to be a little different, so you have to experiment with it. But if you can find that angle that does it, if you keep the weight lower, execute higher repetitions, you will feel a massive burn in that posterior deltoid. And that's probably the best way you know that it's working. Usually on this exercise, when I feel the burn the most, it's actually as I'm coming out of that stretch position. Another great exercise with which to work on the posterior deltoid is this one, number 3. This is the face pull row. Now, the face pull row does not come anywhere close to isolation of the posterior deltoid. In fact, this is a compound movement, and it works the middle traps, it works the rhomboids, it works the lower traps, it works the external rotators of the shoulder, including those of the rotator cuff, infraspinatus and teres minor, and then of course the posterior deltoid. So it does not isolate. And I would make an argument that it's probably not even the best for hypertrophy of the posterior deltoid, especially when you juxtapose it to the first 2 exercises that we saw that give you a huge stretch on that muscle at the bottom of the eccentric. However, I would make an argument that the face pull row is phenomenal from a shoulder health perspective. Every single one of those muscles that I just mentioned are common weak links in the chain for people that come into the physical therapy clinic with neck pain, upper back pain, shoulder pain, you name it. And so the nice thing about this exercise is it really evenly distributes the work among all those muscles. And so you don't just have one that's getting overworked. This is also a really good exercise if you're trying to get warmed up for another compound lift like a bench press,
It actually has the arms in a somewhat similar position, not exactly the same, but you can get those muscles warmed up and primed, all those stabilizer muscles, before you go in and execute the bench press. So this exercise has a lot of bang for your buck. You can progressively overload it over time and really just get good strength gains in all of those muscles. Now, previously we had said that the posterior deltoid peaks in activity when the shoulder is around 60 to 70 degrees of abduction. But as you can see here in the face pull row, when we pull our fists towards the sides of our head, we're actually going above 90 degrees, maybe around 110 plus or minus 10 degrees there. And so how is that optimal for posterior deltoid? Well, we're also engaging shoulder external rotation as we pull our arms back. And so remember, the posterior deltoid also facilitates external rotation. And not only that, when our arms are up and we're going into external rotation, kind of around that 90-90 abduction position that we've talked about in other videos, the angle of abduction in which the posterior deltoid is most active actually shifts upward a little bit. So it's no longer going to be as active 60 to 70 degrees. It's going to be above 90 degrees, probably around 100, 110, something in that vicinity.
From a strength perspective, we want to be moving as much weight as possible. So there are some exercises that you might have seen. Some people have advertised these online. Here is a behind the back upright row. I'm not a big fan of this one. I don't find that I really get a huge amount of posterior deltoid on this one. I don't like the movement very much. It's a pretty small range of motion. Another example being the 45-degree vertical row. There have been some studies, as you can see right here, that have shown that you get a lot of posterior deltoid and middle deltoid on this one. The problem with those two exercises is that I'm not aware of any really highly successful strength or bodybuilding athletes that have used those exercises to a huge extent as part of their training. There is one exercise, though, that has stood the test of time that is actually pretty good for strengthening these posterior deltoids, and that is this one. This is a bent over rear delt fly, and this, generally speaking, will utilize dumbbells. Okay. The benefit of this exercise is that you might actually be able to move more weight per repetition because you're bent over. Gravity is naturally pulling your arms down, and so it makes it a little easier to keep the scapulas protracted, okay? Remember, if the scapulas start to retract excessively, you start getting excessive contribution from the middle traps and rhomboids and less from the posterior deltoid. So when you're bent over, gravity is pulling those arms down. You really want to try to keep those scapulas protracted and then do that as you bring the arms up in that position, okay? If you keep the scapulas protracted, posterior deltoid is going to remain maximally active there, okay? And you don't want to go so high, right, that you start getting a ton of that scapular retraction. But keep the scapulas protracted. Imagine you're swimming in that money. Every dollar bill that you touch, you get to keep. And if you keep that in mind when you're doing this bent over rear delt fly, I think you'll be in good shape there. So hopefully this video gave you a good understanding about how to best go after the posterior deltoid from a strength and hypertrophy standpoint. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.